Hello everyone, I hope you're doing great today. Make sure you check out the podcast in the description and my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac. I have a short message before the story starts, so I hope you enjoy that and hope you enjoy these stories. So for today I'd like to share this. I think, as always, when it comes to your mental health, it's very important to understand that it's a constant battle and it's not necessarily something that will get better overnight. So if you have rough days with it, remember it doesn't make you a failure, it's just a hard time and it'll pass. Because I used to find if I thought of myself as a failure for not having a great day with my mental health, I'd feel a lot worse and not really get anywhere. So just accept it's an up and down battle and consistency is key. So I hope that helps people. I hope you enjoy the story. Take care and I'll speak to you all soon. This story took place in the early 70s. So I was roughly 6 years old at the time. My grandparents went on a weekend trip and returned to their home. It had snowed while they were gone, and this is important later. When they returned to their home, they noticed things were tossed and moved about. It became clear that somebody had invaded their home while they're gone. As they looked around, they began to notice that nothing was actually taken. My grandpa had a safe in the spare room which was found open. There was cash and jewellery nearby, but none of that was taken. They kept documents in that safe. They noticed that their marriage certificate was missing, which is really weird. My grandpa made his way to the back door, which was partially opened. He opened it, and when you exit onto the step, it then extends onto a large open backyard near woods, and he noticed snow prints immediately. It was almost as though that they'd exited through the back door and walked into the yard. He also noticed that the prints didn't appear to be human. They were half hoof prints and almost human in size. Now they lived in Illinois and they only have a small number of animals like squirrels and deers and raccoons, so definitely not normal. He followed the tracks out to the backyard. They completely stopped right in the middle. The yard was fenced in, but the prints completely ended as though nobody ever went there before. But why did they steal the marriage certificate and completely disappear or fly away? Now my grandpa was always a no-nonsense kind of person. He was a World War II veteran. My grandpa really wasn't worried. He would never play pranks on people or joke about anything, so seeing him so baffled and scared was something that always stayed with me. Now, we drove to their home later that day with my dad. They lived in a smaller, one-bedroom home. My dad took a ladder and went to find clues, but he found the prints there too. The marriage certificate was never found. They eventually moved from the home. They lived in 4 other homes in the general area and experienced other things. It's like something followed them. At one of their new homes, they heard their doorbell ring at 3 a.m. They woke up and Grandma opened the back door to see a black figure that appeared human but was see-through. She screams and quickly slams the door shut. My grandpa grabs one of the fireplace pokers and swings the door open, but the thing's gone now. In the short amount of time that he opened the door, this figure, if it was human, couldn't have gone anywhere. There was nowhere to hide. My father also experienced a lot of strange things growing up too. I was hiking in the Willamette National Forest on a trail that I'm very familiar with. I had my 2 dogs with me, a hound and a Labrador, and we just gone up a very steep hill and I sat down for a rest. My dogs were just cruising around, sniffing little creatures and having a good time, when suddenly one of the dogs starts growling and starts down the trail that we just come from. Just like that, they both get up next to me and start growling, starting down the trail. It's not in a particularly bushy area, so I can actually see very far. I don't see anything, but the dogs were adamant something was there. Maybe a cougar? After a while they calmed down and we kept going and looped back on another trail. I had a pocket knife with me that I carried out for the next few miles and we got back safely, and I never found out what actually scared the dogs so much. I think it's weird because I literally couldn't see anything for miles, and they say that dogs usually pick up on the supernatural or paranormal. Since then, I've been much more on edge going on to my hikes, and I still don't know what happened to this day. Years ago, man, I am old, but let's say mid-90s, I worked as a woodland firefighter while in the army reserves. I worked as a spotter. Basically, I was stationed in a giant fire tower in the middle of a national park. My job was just as it sounds: binoculars and looking out for fire, smoke, or other telltale signs of a fire. My nearest comrade was 5 miles or so from me. My days consisted of working my shift, taking long walks around the fire tower, being on lookout for anybody who might be having illegal fires, looking out for wildfire, and staying afoot for bears and wolves. The way our shift worked back then was 1 week on and 1 week off, so we'd actually sleep in the towers, cook our food there, and use the nearby toilets and showers. So one day, I come across an illegal bear trap. I had several ranger friends, and I safely set off the trap and then picked it up to take back to the station on one of my treks out for food in my jeep. Poaching is illegal in the park and carried a big fine even back then with some jail time, but it did not stop them trying. I then heard gunshots, rifle shots, and head back to my tower. We did have a rifle in the tower, but just for emergencies. Just a few months back, I had a fellow spotter who had been mauled by a grizzly, so each tower now has a rifle. I looked with my binoculars but didn't see anything. I radioed to my coworker Ben, an older guy in the adjacent tower. He hadn't heard anything today but come across a few traps himself. The night after dinner, I had franken beans and toast. I was writing to my future wife when I heard the rumbling of a truck, thinking it's Ben. He occasionally made the trek over and would crack open a soda and chew fat for a bit. Instead, I see 4 men with rifles get out of the truck. One looked around and leaned up against the truck while the other 3 grabbed the traps and began to set them up. I grabbed the rifle and my lantern and head down the stairs. I was only 21, a farmer's son from rural Virginia, and even with one development behind me, I was naive. I should have called it into the Rangers, but I thought I could take on some of this. I barely got a "hey, what are you doing" out of my mouth before I was roughly shoved by rough hands. My lantern fell and cracked. The rifle was kicked away from me. I felt the breath of air leave my chest as I was violently kicked in the belly. I barely had caught my breath when I was grabbed by 2 of the men and shoved forward into the woods. It seemed like we were walked for miles, but in reality it's probably 1. However, I noticed that there were no sounds in the forest. It's fairly silent. It's usually a canopy of sounds, even in the night time. Owls, wolves, and crickets, but this night, nothing. Suddenly I'm shoved onto my knees and I felt hot tears well up. I thought to my mum, my dad, my little sister, brother, and fiance, who are all back in Virginia. I heard the rack of a gun and I shut my eyes and prayed. Suddenly night erupted. However, it was the sounds of sirens. Those are forest rangers, and behind them in his pickup, Ben, who had tried to radio me that he had seen and heard a car engine, came to my tower when I didn't reply. The poachers are arrested. Ben drove me back to the tower and I'm still shaking. He didn't lay into me for not following procedure and just said, "That was close, kid." I ended up leaving the job months later to take a job closer to home, but I never ran into poachers during this time. I kept in contact with Ben for a while, sent him an invite to my wedding and then a photo of my firstborn in 1997. However, as time usually does, we lost track of one another, and a few years back I googled him. He would have been 75 or close to it when he sadly passed away a few years ago. I don't know whatever come with the poachers, I just know I don't want to meet them again. I could give you a million times as a kid and young adult that I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, out there all by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further as we got older because of thoughts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated from high school. It was our last day of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camp. We had spent the entire summer just building and camping out there, having a good time. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp and walk for what felt like miles before we come to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new for both of us. We got to the camp and set up and have a fire going, and my plan is to wait until nightfall, play Monopoly. Now, for the sake of backstory, my friend and I, well, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants that you come across. He had no fear of going and camping alone. If I spent 10,000 hours out in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports than the woods. Also, I never was brave enough to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go out far at all because I was alone. I can never shake the feeling of being watched, which was just paranoia but still uneasy feeling. Anyway, camp is going under fire, but it's getting lower and needs some woods. Sun is going down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on his little chair he always brought with him. I'd say we're just generally having a good time and are quite relaxed. I was crouched over, breaking some excessive limbs off some logs that we gather for the fire, when all of a sudden, a strong breeze comes and cuts through the clearing. I can't tell you if it's the suddenness of it that really surprised me, but we both look at each other immediately after. The breeze went on long enough to flicker out the fire, putting it to a small flame. We both sat there completely still, in almost total darkness and silence. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could actually hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again. Definitely two legs. By the sound of it, they're pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it had started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound it had to be a crouch this time. I was crouching by my buddy, and I knew something was staring at me in the dark now. My friend grabs my shoulder and said, "Hey man." And I felt this sudden surge of fear. I could feel it in my friend and hear it in his voice too. I had been so fixated on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I didn't even consider being afraid. But this is true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after grabbing some leaves and he puts them onto the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire. We were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang back to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and kept the fire going. I got some sticks and logs, and neither of us actually took our fire off that spot or moved for another hour. Finally, the leaves crunched and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched with us without moving for longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill, almost like spoiled eggs. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into that tent, and I had a very short light sleep with my head on the ground. My friend never slept. In the morning we packed up and silently went back home. To this day we don't talk about it. And in the 7 or 8 years since it happened, my friend had never actually camped alone out there. I always loved the chance to get out into national forests and parks. I really like jogging. I find a true tranquility when I'm going through them with nothing but the cool summer's air with me. I would do it in winters too, but it was a lot worse because obviously the leaves were very slippery and you wouldn't always see people about outside of the occasional park ranger. But this story took place on one summer's evening. I was feeling really good. I made a playlist and was listening to some podcasts while I was jogging. I set out at about 9 PM, so it was still kind of light outside. As I was jogging, I couldn't help become more and more aware of how dark it seemed to be getting, quick, and I mean almost too quick. I'd go on my phone for literally less than 5 minutes, and when I looked up, it got noticeably darker. Not just in the sense of my eyes adjusting. I mean, it was a weird feeling. And I feel like somebody's watching me. I decide just to try and walk back because I'm getting really tired now, which is another strange thing. I've come to realize it might have been my body's response to fear, but I felt drained and really tired in a way that I've never felt it before. I decide to press on regardless. Cycle through my songs and feel good again. Now as I'm walking, I've realised that there's a mist that's setting over the park. Now this is something that I've never experienced before. Well, I have, just not in the summertime, so it's something that I found very strange. I start to hear interference with my headphones too, and think it might be because of the moisture from the fog and take them off. That's when I realise that I can hear a hissing sound. It's not a normal sound that you would hear from electric interference, it's almost like an animal making it, but I've never heard it before, and my heart drops. The feeling of being watched overpowers me now. I feel darkness like I've never felt before, like true evil's around. I think maybe there's a park ranger there with his radio messing up. I call out, but I don't hear anyone. I suddenly think it is a bad idea to call out, and I begin jogging. As I start jogging, I hear a crash behind me. I turn to look, and there's a very tall, dark figure just off beside a tree. Now what terrifies me is that there's a tree that's been knocked over that was standing before. I know for a fact that it's either a 1 in a billion chance it fell then and none of the other trees did, or something menacing's following me. Now this thing has to be at least 6'2" and has long arms. It sounds like it's describing exactly me so far. I can't see any eyes, but I can tell that this thing's facing directly towards me. I wipe my eyes, and it doesn't move. I say, hey, if this is a ranger, you need to stop because I'm scared now. And I'm met with silence. It slowly moves behind the tree. I've seen enough now. I can't deal with this. I go into a fight or flight state and I'm literally frozen for a second. I tell myself, no, I'm not going out like this, and I start sprinting as quick as I can. The whole time I'm running, I can hear this thing chasing just behind me. I get to the car park and there's no other cars there, so it's me alone now. Great. So if this thing attacks me, I'm screwed. I jump into my truck and drive as quick as I possibly can, getting out of the wooded area. Now the craziest thing is, this thing's still following me. I can hear things breaking behind me, like a very tall and very heavy thing's chasing me through the woods. I'm literally screaming and praying for God to help me out in this moment. I can just about see him in my mirrors, but it's very foggy at the time. I have to slam on the brakes at one point too because I nearly hit a tree because how dense the fog had become. I continue driving and eventually make it back onto the main road. I'm literally crying the entire time. I end up going to a ranger station and explaining what I saw, and they say I'm not the only one that's reported something similar. People have been reporting it as a bear, but it's not possible because there's no bears in this specific area. I have no idea what it was, and nor do the park rangers, but they say I wasn't the only one who had that reaction, and there was a strange smell that accompanied that thing. I didn't get that close to find out, but everyone described it exactly the same as me. They're already doing patrols trying to find that thing, but they never found it. It still shakes me to my core thinking about it to this day. So this didn't happen to me, but I live in the area where it took place. My friend and I were discussing the scariest things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. So this guy was with 5 of his friends and was spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk but had a few beers to unwind one night, so one of them goes out to the outhouse to use the bathroom. He can hear some faint beating sounds in the distance like a low drum. So he finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come and check out the sound. So they all grab their rifles and walk out the ridge of their cabin, down the holloway behind it and up the other side. It's a pretty rocky area, so the sound travels far. They could tell that it's just over the hill, so 5 of them spread out about 50 feet and walk up to the top. They can't see completely over there because there's large bushes around them. Now they just sneak down and try and see what it is. One of them goes over there and he stands there and watches for about 30 seconds to a minute before telling his friends that they have to run as quick as they can and saying what he saw was evil and they need to get out of there now. He said all he could see was a bunch of naked people dancing around a fire pit with some kind of pentagram on the floor. He never told them about everything he saw. He just said he was too scared ever to go back in the woods again or near that area. I was born and raised in Charlotte, NC, and still live on the east side. There's a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which was mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and underdeveloped land that is discreetly placed amidst busy streets and highways. You almost don't realise it because of the stretches of infrastructure around it. There's a myth and folklore tale about a devil church or satanic ritual area deep within that park. There's a few videos of people trying to find it. Now in my senior year of high school, after searching around the internet, I heard about where this is supposed to be and decided I want to find it. So my girlfriend and I at the time decided to try and find it on the road that leads into the church. We end up driving down miles of winding roads behind a Carmax that borders the dense woods of the park where a small neighbourhood of sorts is. I think I gotten the 2 street names wrong, but they're very close to the spot. Now cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we found a seemingly abandoned dirt track offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind that there's almost no streetlights anywhere. We're driving about another 2 or 3 minutes and there had been a pickup truck behind us for maybe 50 feet or so. Upon seeing the dirt track and everything else around, our interest had peaked. We stopped the car to discuss what we want to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track simultaneously. The pickup truck ahead abruptly stops and stays in place. We notice this, having pulled finally into the dirt road at this point. We're immediately frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly puts their car into reverse and began to immediately back up towards us at max speed. I throw my car into reverse and panic in an attempt to back away from where we come from. I was able to get turned around and drive back into the woods fairly quickly. The driver's accelerating at us at full speed now and I have to floor it to try and get out of there. We literally never looked back. We never ended up finding the church and have no idea who was following us in the woods that day. I'm not sure if this is the right place for this, but when I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas, and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down a trail. This trail curves through the marsh into a big patch of woods, about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall or spring, after heavy rain, a fog would often settle over the marshes, as it was much lower than the surrounding area. It really looks like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he's probably about 13 and I was 16 at the time, decided it's a great idea to explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it into the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would get dark by the time we got home, and we head for the trail. Once we're in the trail and moving, it hit us just how thick the fog is. We'd only been walking for about a minute or two, but we have absolutely no visibility behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. So we continue walking for a few more minutes, now we come up to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we're only about 100 yards from the entrance of the woods. At this point, there's a small lake on the left side of the trail and some marshland further to the right. Now we began walking past the lake when we hear a splash. Definitely much bigger than a fish jumping, almost like a person done it. It's a really strange sound. Now we couldn't have been up there for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could only have been about 10 feet, a figure steps out from the brush bordering the fog. Now, it's so thick that we can't make out details, but he must have been about 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As this figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and stopped. Its head shot over and looked right at us. It felt like it must have been an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true terror in that moment that I've never felt before. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly, the figure took over into the marshland running again. There were no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that we ran. We kept on sprinting until we got back home, and we never went back to that area again. I grew up in the Midwest US. When I was a senior in high school, I was out for a hike at a local trail in the National Forest. This is a good 20 miles from town, way out in the sticks. It's a box canyon, so you start at the rim and hike down into the canyon. It was autumn and late afternoon when I pulled into the empty parking area, but there's plenty of light around. But by the time I got to the bottom, the sun's pretty low. I was down in the canyon and get the feeling that something isn't quite right. I start looking behind me as I walk every few steps. I can't shake this feeling. Finally, on one of these backward glances, I spotted a man peeking out from behind a tree, not far at all, maybe 100 feet away. It was the weirdest thing to catch somebody watching me. He knew I'd seen him and stepped out saying, "I'm not looking to scare you." He's a big adult male, very old looking, and I'm a scrawny 16-year-old kid, and we're on a trail in the public park. There's no reason to hide like that. He seems alarmed that I've even seen him. The only reason he was out there is if he's weird. I mumble something about getting back to my car, and this horrifying grin comes across his face. He's just standing there staring at me. I'm running for a long time and I can still tell that he's watching me. and when I get back to the parking area, there's no cars other than mine, which added to the weirdness. I realised later that he must have been out there for some time because of the state of his clothes. It's interesting how when you get the sensation that you're being watched, it's normally true. I have no idea what his intentions were. I'm just really glad that I was aware of what was going on and he didn't spring up on me, because I don't know what he was capable of. I went to a summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we'd do as a group activity every day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight out onto the water. The two square floating docks further apart. One of the two floating docks is further away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp, I'd never seen anybody use the second dock. One day on the group, a dozen 11-year-olds got to the bright idea that we're going to swim out to the faraway dock. I consider this to be a challenge. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange looking spider on the ladder that you had to climb up. I would have a heart attack. It was quite large, in terms of overall footprint. Probably 3 inches from end to end. Nah, screw that. Spiders, of course, are normal critters in nature, but this one stood out as looking unusual. After the long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. No way did they just go over that spider like that. It was relaxing and we were all having a good time. We started really messing around and decided to play around for a bit. We're playing a regular game where we shuffle towards one corner of the dock, making it sink. Oh god. As the corner of the dock starts to sink and fill with water, suddenly hundreds of giant spiders come, frantically crawling out from between the boards, swarming over around the feet of those who are still standing on the dry ground. This dock was theirs apparently. We all began to scream immediately and jump up trying to get away, but the spiders are in the water too. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair as I began hopelessly trying to get them off. Adrenaline kicks in and we swim to the other side that's spider free, but this is a childhood trauma that lingers with me. I had not really been afraid of spiders before, but this is a turning point. The thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, unaware to how many of them were there, creeps me out to this day. That is literally hell on earth. I'm a child of the mountains and my hometown was completely mountainous, so I spent most of my childhood running through the forests and stuff, and one event that happened when I was 10 remains unexplained. I was on top of the ridge several hundreds of feet above my house when I started hearing my biological father yelling. In a very redneck area, he had a very distinct voice with no accent, so it's not really possible to confuse him for anyone else. His voice was coming from the other side of the ridge, which is a bit weird in retrospect because nobody over that way actually lived in that area and everyone avoided everyone in there. Even when hunting, we'd go around. The train was worse to deal with, but it's what we done. He starts calling my name, so I go down there. But the voice isn't getting any closer. I start feeling dread washing over me, and I suddenly remember my father's on a trip to Germany. I've never ran so fast. I didn't realise it until I got to the other side of the ridge, but the forest had been completely silent on the other side of the ridge, which never happens unless there's predators or the wind picks up. Normally, I'd think I was just getting closer to black bear territory, but the voice obviously makes it confusing. Unlike a number of stories like this I've heard over the years, the experience didn't really stop me from going into the woods. It just made me more curious. I've never had an explanation for it since, and it kind of worries me. The closest thing I've heard it could be is like a skinwalker, but I'm not sure. It may even be a person who is trying to stalk me in, but I guess I'll never know. Hey everyone. About 2 weeks ago, I had a really scary experience and my husband didn't believe me, but last night, he had a very similar experience and now we're both wondering what we could have possibly seen. So our puppy was barking to go outside and use the bathroom. It's about 4 or 5 a.m. I took him out and stood on the steps of our deck because I didn't want to get my feet wet. My dog was using the bathroom when I looked up and I see something across the yard. It was slowly walking towards me, one step at a time. Its eyes were super reflective. I thought it was a deer, but its eyes were so tall and staring at me, and it wasn't running away. I hurried the dog up and we ran inside. I have reoccurring night terrors, so at first, my husband thinks it's just that, but I was crying and shaking and could barely be spoken to. He tells me it's probably a deer, but I wasn't convinced, and I refused to take the dog out after midnight again. As for my husband's experience, it was early in the morning, about 5 a.m. The dog was barking and he took him outside. Once again, my husband stood on the deck outside. He didn't have his glasses, but when he looks up, he saw something tall standing in the forest near our backyard. He said he saw it walking slowly, almost gliding. He said that the moment he made eye contact, his nose was bleeding. My husband is typically not prone to them either. He said he wanted to get a closer look but felt the need to go inside, almost like an instinct. My husband's a zookeeper. He's not really afraid of animals and can recognize many of them. I still have no idea what this is. We live in Eastern PA. This happened around the 1900s in the countryside of South Brazil. My grandmother's grandfather was coming home from a ball very late at night. He lived in a small farm, and so to come from the party place he had a long way to walk in the middle of nothing, with just trees and bushes. And well, you can imagine how the countryside of Brazil was, especially back then. He said that while he was walking, all of a sudden he heard strange noises and lights. Scared, he hid in the bushes to see what was happening. He said there were very little men speaking in a foreign language. Behind him, there was 2 huge plates stacked on top of another, with lights all over them. He stayed hiding and praying until they left and ran for his life. My grandmother says that she's heard this story a few times in her youth from him, and the narrative always stayed the same, with him praying after. Only after she married and moved to the big city and had children did she start to hear about these things being known as aliens and other things. Her grandfather at the time would have had no concept of aliens. After a heavy night of drinking and camping, we woke up and nobody wanted to make breakfast, so we decided to drive into town and find a diner. We're approaching where the dirt meets the pavement and come up on dozens of sheriffs backloading the road, 2 of which have rifles pointed towards us. We stop the truck about 40 feet from them and hear them yell over the intercom to stick our hands up now. They then instruct us to approach on foot with our hands in the air. They search my truck and find it full of loaded guns and beer. That's when they tell us that a Forest Service agent had been shot and killed nearby, and eventually let us go, but tell us our camping gear is out of bounds until the murderer is found. We didn't want to leave our camping gear and go home, so we ended up at a nearby casino, continuing partying there. A few hours later, Someone in the casino says there's loads of cops outside. We go outside and there must have been 100 sheriffs, local PD everywhere. Apparently, that same murderer had stopped at the casino gas station and an officer recognized him. Then Leo drew his gun, murderer went for his and the Leo shot him dead. We went back to the camp and home the next day. I checked the newspaper articles and they made a map of where the murder happened, and it's only 200 yards away from our campsite. I have a friend who's a trail ranger. He's basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking them down and whatnot. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he said he was going to head back, but it's a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finished up the last one when he hears voices. He kept in mind that he's far off the beaten path. He calls out and no one replies. As it was getting dark, he starts to head back and found his ATV won't start. He then realizes that the batteries are not connected. He reconnects it and started to drive but isn't going fast. Less than half a mile later, the whole thing died. He radioed back saying, "Hey guys, someone pick me up." They said they would do it but are gonna take an hour. He said, "Can the other guy come back?" and he said no. So he settled down, made a small fire, but heard voices again. It's dark and he's angry. The voices sound like an argument now. Someone was angry, yelling at someone else who sounded scared. He called out and said, "Does anyone need help?" The voices don't care. He thinks they're less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed again, and they said they're having trouble finding what path he'd be on, and haven't left yet. He said to them just to get another ranger there. About 3 minutes go by, and the voices start again. He decides to walk there, hoping maybe there's some drunk people that have a map. He walks in their direction, but the voices seem to be getting further away as he got closer. Finally, 20 minutes later, he gave up and walks back. He got a radio call, and they said the other guy was passed out, covered in vomit, and was taken to hospital. They don't know exactly where I come from still because he crossed off everywhere that he went. Then the radio died, and the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decides to listen to what they're arguing about, and picks up on things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take, and I knew you were gonna do this, you idiot, and I don't care." His guess is that 2 hunters are arguing over a kill. Then he heard something intelligible. Then silence. Bang. A gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that he heard nothing. Just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours but found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, a shallow grave was found and a man who'd been shot in the head was also found. Thing was, it was a skeleton who had been there for years. So either the argument he heard was somehow from the past, or someone else got murdered recently when he was there. This happened while I was doing my army service in Switzerland. I'm not allowed to talk about exactly what we were doing there, but I'll try and keep this clear. My company has installed a huge antenna and it has to be guarded day and night. So we're on a hill, away from a city near a massive forest. It's 1800 hours and I had just started my watch of 6 hours with another soldier. Everything's fine. We smoke cigarettes and keep ourselves occupied until our night watch ends. Then, we receive a call from our superior who said that one of the soldiers that's supposed to watch hasn't come out and we have to stay for another 6 hours. So we tossed a coin to see who's going to stay from midnight till 6 AM with temperatures of -20. And of course I lost. And I had to wait for the other soldiers to come and join me for the rest of the night. They sent Jon Snow. No, I'm just kidding. They've only sent another soldier, but not the best because I knew he would sleep all night when I saw him climbing the hill with his sleeping bag. And that's what he did. He immediately took place in the tent and fell asleep. It was the coldest and longest night of my life. Nothing special about it. The weirdest part though happened in the morning. We received another call from our superior telling us that we had an NBC exercise. It means that we have to wear all-day chemical suits. The one with the gas mask and everything. I was really upset and exhausted because I wasn't able to sleep with that thing on, and sleep was my only reward for the 12-hour watch. Well, I get out of this tent, and I saw this thing that still scares me to this day. I see a woman standing next to the antenna. She wasn't moving, she was just standing there, meters from my tent. I couldn't see her face because of the sun starting to rise behind her. I knew she's a woman because she had really long hair. Remember that we're in the middle of nowhere and she's standing there, not moving like she's frozen. I start to freak out and call the other guy to see what I'm looking at. I don't know why, but he wasn't scared at all, and he told her to leave. But she didn't. She just stood there staring at us. I was confused. How could a woman ignore two soldiers in a forbidden area? I mean, we're in Switzerland. The army's not that impressive, I know, but people usually don't do this kind of thing. They would just move away, especially when it's 6 in the morning. And what she's doing in the middle of nowhere is beyond me, not dressed for cold climate. How long was she there? And how did she get there? I don't even see any footsteps. So, there's so many questions running through my head. The other soldier didn't think twice and starts walking towards her. When he almost reaches her, she starts running very fast into the forest. I see her going deep into the forest and I never see her again. I'm a really rational thinker, but I have absolutely no explanation for this. Thank God there was someone there with me because nobody would have believed me if it was just me there at that time. My father told me a story many times when I was growing up of something that happened to him. I know he believes it to be true, and he's not a very superstitious person whatsoever. Very analytical on the other hand. My dad was 5 years old, camping with the Boy Scout troop. They sent everyone for firewood. It was dusk, so he went off on his own and a little further than the other kids. He wanted to gather more firewood than anyone else. He got far enough away that nobody else had picked through the fallen wood and started gathering. Along his way, he went until he almost stepped on a tiny tribe of Indians, moving around a fire, dancing. He said they were tiny, and they didn't pay him any attention as he crouched down to look at them. He ran over to go and tell his friends, but by the time he come back, they're all gone. He said he's never seen anything like it in his life, and he was sure someone was playing a prank on him, but how? How could somebody make a prank look that real? I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings on here. Strange sounds, weird creatures, and strange disappearances. I've dealt with these in my past times and hikes, and even just relaxing in the park. Here's one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the Bonnies, and the only road there is a gravel road that's washed away. Without a good car, you're not getting anywhere. My cousins lived in a trailer with their mums, right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased, being the youngest. My grandma was in hospital with my aunt, so our oldest cousin, who I'll call D, had to watch us. D was, and still is, the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regards. He would mess with us and play around, but actually cared about us. The whole day we were playing around, but we would usually play more at night, like hide and seek, etc. We've been playing pretty far away from the house and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted. So I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property, hiding behind a log. I heard my cousins getting closer, so I ran and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, and we saw my cousin D. He looked at us and kinda growled. We all run from him, thinking it's a game. We ran back to the gravel road when we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did in a weird way, gloatingly in fact. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table, they come into the living room from the bedroom. We had obviously woke him up, and we said we saw him chasing us, and he got wide-eyed. He said stay in the bedroom. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he come in and told us not to worry, that he's just scaring us. It wasn't until 4 years later, when I was 13, he told me the truth. He's pretty certain that it was a skinwalker. He told me he's dealt with it before and was terrified it hunted us, and he was too scared to tell me at the time because I'd get worried. So with a few fraternity brothers and I are backpacking in the Nafala National Park and met some guys. They're locals. I mean, not local hangout bros, but local backwoods people who lived there for generations, hate the government and society types. These are guys that have apparently been helping Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber, hide in the national forest by supplying him with food drops. Really weird drunken conversations. They actually took us to one of the hideout drop-off caves. They were too serious, and that's the whole reason that I hated this. They trusted us because some things were said to make them think we're of a similar mindset. Anyway, we parted ways. Spent a few days trying to figure out if it is all lies or not. And that same week, they call Eric Rudolph in the dumpster of a Piggy Wiggly 3 miles from where we met the guys. Every single thing these guys said matched up with the news story. We gave them the bottle of Jack even. They said they'd give it to Eric. Creepy as hell. Hauntingly terrifying in retrospect. So when I was about 5 years old, I was at my sister's graduation party. My father had rented out a pavilion at a heavy wooded area of Country Park. I ended up following some kids throughout the forest, and after a while, I realised I wandered too far from the pavilion and started heading back. I remember not being able to find my way back and ended up being lost for around an hour. As I was walking, a man dressed in white from head to toe appeared to me. He said his name was John. I explained to him that I was lost and told him where my family was. I remember him accompanying me throughout the woods, and he had a very comforting presence about him. After a while, I remembered hearing my uncles calling for me from a distance. I turned to tell John that that's my uncle, but he was gone. I turned the other way, and there was my uncle. I'm 30 now, but can't help wonder exactly what John was and what the meaning of all of this was. I guess I'll write what happened in chronological order. To preface this, I should mention that all of this took place back on my reservation. I'm from Algonquin First Nation from Canada. Another thing I should mention is that on the res, traditional beliefs and legends of the paranormal are still a big part of our community. The attitude of most people towards the paranormal is one of assurance. To us, the paranormal is a regular part of our life. We believe in a spirit world, and we believe that sometimes these beings can cross over from their world to ours. Well, I tell paranormal stories to my non-native friends. They're always in disbelief of what I tell them, but they've had no paranormal experiences, unlike me having a bunch. And most everyone I know on the res has had one. I don't really care to explain it, but it is what it is. Anyway, here's the story. This happened in the fall of 2011 when I was 16 years old. I was living in a nearby city with my mum, so I can get a better education than the one I can get at home. But we'd go back every single week to see my dad and little brother. One Friday, during the drive back home, I got a text from a friend of mine. She told me about a party that was happening that night, and she said to me, when am I going to be home so they can pick me up? I gave her a time, and that was that. When we got home, as soon as we stepped inside the house, I see my dad and cousins sitting at the kitchen table drinking. They're both cops on the res, so usually beers with his partner on a Friday evening happens. Means that they had a particularly tough week at work though. Typically, the toughest cases they deal with are ones around children. So a part of me felt sad immediately that something bad's happened. They both look tired and drained, but they're happy to see us. We say our greetings, catch up a little, and my dad asked me if I have any plans. I tell him about the party and where it'll be, and he and our cousin share a weird look. Why are you guys making that face? Did something happen? I say. I don't know, should we tell her? My cousin said, looking at my dad. He laughed and said, yeah, we probably should, because I'm gonna have to be going to a cottage pretty deep in the woods later that evening. They start off by saying the first strange call they get is on a Monday night. There's an elderly woman saying that there's people outside of her home knocking on all of her windows. She can't see anyone, but there must have been at least 3 people, judging by all the different locations of the knocking. They arrive at the woman's home, inspect all around the house, even the woods, but find nothing. They tell her that it's probably some teenagers playing tricks on her, but sadly there's nothing they can do really, besides patrol the area in case they come back. On Wednesday night, the same woman called again with the same problem. It had been raining that day too, and there was mud everywhere, so they figure at least they're gonna know where they went. But they don't find a thing. This is when they start feeling like something is off, because one of the windows where the woman was, she's adamant that there was someone there, but it's completely impossible to get there without going through a huge puddle. This is when they start to think she's lying, but they just told her the same thing they told her friend a few nights prior. By Thursday night, everyone on the res had been talking about these strange experiences. It turns out that she wasn't the only one experiencing it. She was just the one to call. I mean, all of this is taking place on a res, so it wasn't long before people were linking it to the supernatural. My dad still wasn't sure if it's just a group of teens playing a prank on people, but they get another call from the same woman for the same reason. They rush over there, but are met with the same situation, except this time, the neighbour walked over looking pale as a ghost. That's saying something for him. He says, "Is this about the knock-in?" They notice he's a little shaky. "Yeah. Did you see something?" They ask him, and he nods and said, "You guys are gonna think I'm crazy, but yeah." And he goes on to explain what he saw. He said he stepped out for a cigarette on his front porch when he heard knocking. He looked around to see where it's coming from, and when he looked to his neighbour's house, he saw it. There's a black figure standing outside of the woman's window. The same one with the puddle, looking at her home. He said it looked humanoid in stature, but completely made out of a shadow. You could tell it was something solid-ish, but you cannot make out any features on it. He stared at it completely in shock, and watched that thing as it knocked a couple of times, then darted around the house knocking on every window, moving so quick it's like a blur, and it went around the house a few times. The man ran across the road into the tree line, behind one tree in particular. The man was frozen but couldn't look away. It then leaned out from behind the tree, staring directly at him with yellow eyes that reflected the light similar to a cat's, and then it smiled, showing its small but numerous pointed sharp teeth. I almost had a heart attack, he said while it happened. Fast forward to Friday. Stories are being exchanged all over the res about sightings and experiences people are having. On top of that, multiple people are experiencing the knocking. There's also quite a few sightings with everyone describing the creature in the same way. One woman was bringing her trash to the side of the road, and she thought she saw the woman somewhere in her peripheral vision standing near the trees. She walks back up the driveway and into her home, feeling as though she's being watched. Right before she's about to open her door to go back inside to her home, she looked back and saw two reflective yellow eyes staring at her from the trees, saying it's about 5 feet above the ground. Another couple was driving at night and said they saw a humanoid figure too. "You sure you still want to go to that party?" my dad asked. But my friends were already pulling into the driveway. I gave my family hugs and kisses goodbye, and they told me to be careful, but I felt fine. A common belief among native people is that negative energy attracts negative energy. Therefore, an evil spirit will draw to people with unresolved issues, traumas, and sinners, I suppose. If you're someone who's spiritual, self-aware, and basically a good person, you're pretty good. So I get to the party, and within 20 minutes, the conversation shifts towards the paranormal experiences everyone's having. I'm really curious about what everyone has to say, because they have stories that I haven't heard yet, but my friend, being 17 and all, couldn't hold her alcohol very well, and was crying about how she wishes she was closer with her brother. I'm trying to make her feel better while listening to everyone else's stories. One of the people from the party was related to the neighbour of the woman who was calling the police. The experience really shook him up, and my friend was just explaining everything that was going on. For one, he smudged his entire home, which is something people do for extra protection from the paranormal. He also went on multiple visits to the elders around the community asking for advice. What we do know about paranormal experiences on the res is that they don't happen as much as they used to. If you talk to one of our elders, they'll have endless stories and even more advice to give about how to protect yourself. One of the explanations that was given to us is that the shadow guy is evidence that someone was doing unauthorized shaky tent ceremony. If you don't know what that is, it's basically like an Ouija board session that takes place inside of a tent. People stand around the tent while the medicine man or medicine woman goes inside asking questions. The tent begins to shake and you hear voices of the spirits coming through. I've never personally been to one because we haven't had a good enough reason to make one, but typically our ancestors use shaken tent ceremonies when they're starving in the dead of winter and need some direction on where the nearest food is. My mum's been to one. Her story's crazy. She described hearing multiple men and women only speak in native tongue, and they're upset that people were doing a shaken tent ceremony when they're not on the verge of death. The people there had to explain that they're only doing the ceremony to prove that it was real, as We had been losing our culture as a result of residential schools, but the spirits are angry, saying that the bridge between the two worlds should never be opened unless necessary, because you don't know who you're talking to. It could be evil spirits. You don't know. Anyway, the elders told him that this spirit crossed over into our world because of a shake and tent ceremony. Someone on the res has been doing them without consultation of the elders, so we start thinking about who would do that without the proper guidance, and so. Then, two of the drunkest dudes say, "Oh, I'm not scared. That thing can't do anything," basically egging it all on, and we're all looking at each other like, why would you disrespect an evil spirit? That's exactly how it's attracted to you. And that's when I decide to leave the sunroom where everyone's hanging out. I went to the living room to console my drunk crying friend when I noticed the rocking chair outside of the porch moving. I slowly moved away, refusing to make direct eye contact, but I do in my peripheral vision. Anyway, I'm inside the cottage and I keep seeing this rocking chair moving back and forth. But another thing we're raised to do in our culture is to ignore paranormal. Spirits feed on energy people give towards them, so if you freak out, if you get angry, if you start crying or yell at it, that's exactly what it wants. It thrives on energy of any kind. So while I knew something messed up was happening, I wasn't about to pay attention. 5 minutes now go by and I still see it out the corner of my eye. That's when my friend screams and she runs on the other side of the sunroom. My other friend, 2, sprints to the girl, number 1, who's sitting, and busts through the French doors onto the balcony. All of this happens in a split second, but I immediately go to the patio and ask what's going on. Girl 1 is crying on the couch with friends all around her. She claims to have seen the spirit. She said she was listening to the boys talk about the spirit when she saw boy 2's face as he was looking onto the balcony behind her. She turned around to see what he's looking at, and directly on the other side of the window was the shadow spirit on the rocking chair smiling at her, literally 3 feet away from her. That's when boy 2 sprinted towards it and burst through the French doors. I walk outside to find boy 2, and he's on the lawn, staring into the woods. I call his name and he looks up. All he says is, "Get everyone inside," and the tone of his voice makes me scared. I get all of us inside the cottage. This is when the phrase, "Come at me, bro," was gaining popularity. So you can imagine the drunk kid yelling that into the woods. It's terrible. I eventually get everyone inside. Boy 2 comes inside and tells everyone to clean up and that we should leave as soon as possible. Everyone has trash bags and we're clearing away the beer cans and whatever. Everyone goes inside the cottage and it's only me and boy 2 in the sunroom now. I look to him for answers and he says, "It's outside." I nod and start cleaning faster. The sooner we're out of here, the sooner we get away from that thing. As we're cleaning in the sunroom, we hear knocking on multiple windows. The entire sunroom's made of glass, but it's dark out, so you can't even see. And he says ignore it. I'm really scared now. Within 2 seconds, someone comes running out of the bathroom and says, "I'll kill whoever's knocking on the bathroom window." But everyone's accounted for. Someone else comes running out of the bedroom saying that there was knocking on the window as well. Now everyone's freaking out, and me and boy 2 and our one other friend are the only sober ones now trying to calm people. We get the place clean and get outside and to the cars immediately. Everyone's getting into the trucks and I'm standing there. The guy looks relaxed, then all of a sudden looks worried and shoves me inside his truck. We peel out of there quick. A few days later, I end up hanging out with boy 2 and he tells me the story from his perspective. He said that when the boys started talking about the spirit, it appeared on the rocking chair behind girl 1. He said he made eye contact with it but couldn't look away. They were staring at each other, and that's when Girl 1 and Boy 2's expression changed. He said it was instinct to defend the people he's with and ran towards it. He said that the feeling he was getting from the Kokji was almost like daring him to do something. He said the second he got up, the Kokji stood up and ran into the woods, disappearing into a blur of the tree line. Boy 2 ran off the porch, looking around the lawn, when he saw it standing there, right next to the woods. It was smiling at him, and he heard it mocking him, calling his name, then disappearing. He didn't see it again until everyone was getting inside the trucks, which explains why he suddenly pushed me inside. He said it was standing on the far end of the truck, super close to us. Later that night, when he dropped everyone off, they realized that they never locked the doors. So he went back to the cottage, but his friend was too scared to go in, so he goes in on his own. But the second he opens the door, he sees that thing standing inside. He locks the door as quick as he can, and they peel out of there. The sightings continued for a few days after that. We definitely weren't the only people on the res to have them kind of experiences. It was the talk of the res. Everyone was curious about what happened. Would it come back? What was it? All I know is that it terrified us, and it's 2018 now, and no one else has seen anything like it since. This happened to my mum, sister and me many years ago. I was about 8 then, I'm 37 now, and my sister is 5 years younger. Back then we lived in a city in the UK, in a not so nice part of town. Don't get me wrong, this wasn't the ghetto or Wild West, but there were nicer places to live. A bit of background information to the story. My dad was self-employed, owned a small factory on the outskirts of the city centre about 5 miles from home. The factory is surrounded by wasteland homes, to mostly derelict and broken buildings. The area was grey, dirty, and covered in graffiti. Hell, not even the city homeless would take refuge here. One day, my dad calls my mum at home. He needed her to come home to the factory to help finish a job, but they only had one car, so it meant us getting the bus. I don't mind. My 8-year-old self was full of adventure and loves the idea of riding the bus to big town. The bus ride's uneventful as we brave the city traffic, eventually going through a forested area, then arriving at our stop. The described earlier, it's not the type of place people go unless they have a specific reason, so it wasn't surprising we're the only ones getting off here. We started in the direction of my dad's factory, which was just under a mile from the bus stop. My sister's asleep in the pushchair as I was jabbering away, when suddenly I become aware my mum's preoccupied. I look at her, but she said, "Keep walking." I noticed she glanced over her shoulder near the tree line. I slowed down, but she tugs my arm and says keep going. I remembered feeling anxious as my mum walks faster, pushchair bumping over uneven slabs. Then I heard him. First the footsteps, clumsy and heavy, then his raspy voice. He was muttering incoherently, having a conversation with, I guess, himself. Suddenly my mum crosses the road, holding my arm tightly, while steering the pushchair. He crosses the road too. My mum's cursing under her breath. We cross again. Whenever you think you're being followed, there's always a nagging doubt you're paranoid. But when we cross the same road for the 4th time in 5 minutes and this guy's still following us, I knew it was on. This was back in the 80s, no mobile phones, no internet and no SOS texts. You're really off grid. But now I can feel adrenaline. We're approaching a T-junction. My dad's factory is only around the corner, but it's about 500 yards away. If you didn't know where you were, you'd assume you're heading further into the ghost town. As we turned the corner, my mum told me to run as fast as I can to get my dad. I hear my mum and the pushchair thundering behind me. My heart is pounding. I ran like my life depended on it. My feet are crunching on broken glass. I don't dare slow down. I could see the small road ahead leading to a car park at the factory. I knew what I had to do. I shout for my dad as loud as I can. My throat is burning as I gulp for air. Hot tears stain my red cheeks. I burst in the door crying and my dad comes out running. He grabs the nearest object and ran towards the car park. I stood looking out there, watching my dad sprint across the car park. I see the pushchair too. My mum told my dad where we'd been followed and points in the direction, and my dad took off. He come back 10 minutes later. The creepy guy's nowhere to be seen. My dad said he probably ran off when he heard me shouting. With all the old empty buildings and wasteland, it's easy to disappear, even into the woods. My dad wanted to take the car and drive around to try and find him, but my mum doesn't want to be alone, even in the sanctuary at the factory, so he agreed to finish up the job, and we all drove home. My parents never reported it to the police. Living in a major city, you get all kinds of unsavory characters, but the police wouldn't have done anything because he never harmed us. He never got the chance. We think he's probably very high or very unwell mentally. Either way, it scared the life out of us. My father sadly died and I needed to clear my head, so went on a solo trip to a cabin in Oregon with my dog. Now I had a couple of weird things happen. My Pop-Tart incident still trips me out, but I think I can write that one off as maybe someone messing with me. But here's my story. I'll be the first to say that all of this could have happened in my head, like with anything. The mind's a freaky place and can play tricks on you. Now whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad always told me that in life, you shouldn't be scared of ghosts. Fear the living, they'll hurt you. In my late teenage years, I come into some money after my father committed suicide and I received an inheritance from him. Near the time of my dad's passing, he and my mum owned a cabin in Oregon. The cabin had been put up for sale by my mum, who could no longer afford the payments or renting it out. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month and was in the process of finalising a paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month's time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all things that were going on. I quit work, packed up snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog and headed up in my dad's car that he had wheeled to me to the cabin. Now, this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year when they're not using it. I had keys to the cabin and also had the code to the alarms, so I didn't feel the need to stop at the rental management company and advise them of my stay. That has nothing to do with my story, but I felt the need to mention it anyway. The first few days of the cabin are normal, and nothing seems unusual. I spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and in the evenings I played PlayStation or listened to music, drinking and smoking on the balcony. I already stocked up on food, cigarettes and liquor, so I was pretty much shut inside apart from the occasional venture out to the shops or the slopes. With my dog as company and my DVDs and PlayStation as entertainment, I was content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories. Bottom store had the living room and a side guest bedroom, along with the small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms, along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time was spent either in the living room, kitchen or master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to darkness scares me. Anyhow, the 3rd day came around. I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog, playing games, etc. It was pretty heavy snowfall out, and I didn't feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area, there's only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours, maybe a block away from one another. All other cabins aside from these 2 are a mile away from ours, surrounding us with mostly forestry and very tall pine trees. Both these cabins are empty from the past couple of days from what I knew, and no one's currently there. Now, that's some background and I'll jump to the weirdness. Around midday, while outside with my dog, I noticed what appears to be footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked semi-fresh, like someone's been there in the last half hour before me. I thought that maybe someone was staying in the cabin near me that I haven't noticed. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. Well, alright, whatever. The prints lead away from the cabin, but disappear in the snow towards the tree line. Disregarding the footprints, I went back inside. Nighttime came around and I decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed, running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stay silent. I can hear him moving around downstairs, back and forth. After around 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me, starts doing his doggy dance, as a sign that he needs to pee or wants to go outside for something. Oh, well fine. I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him. He didn't want to pee though. As soon as he gets outside, he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier, but he also kept sniffing the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. That's really odd. After he figured out that I'm not going anywhere near it, he sat down and just stares into the darkness. This is a bit unusual for him, but alright. Maybe there are forest animals out there that he wants to chase down, but screw this. Do not want to chance anything, so I pull him back inside and we both head back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was lying in bed when I hear what sounded like hoofs walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I rationalised that it could have been a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind-hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing, the footsteps aren't spaced apart like a man's stride would be, so that was freaking me out. Midnight, I also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting to see something, but there's nothing. Alright, you know what? I'm a tough guy and at the time considered myself fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out on the balcony. Screw it, right? As soon as I was outside, I lit up my cigarette and started wondering what this could be getting onto the roof with my light. Nothing there, and snow on the top was undisturbed. Crazy. Maybe this is all in my head. What about the midnight before? I'm paranoid now. But I think it's in my mind and calmed down. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, and I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was little taller than our cabin, around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between 2 branches. It was squatted on one branch with its arms extended above its head, holding onto the branch. Wow. What is that? I wasn't sure if I was really seeing that thing, and just stared motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. The thing still did not move. I pulled my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in that direction, but something in my head told me, don't. So I walked back towards the inside, pulling midnight with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but nothing's there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night, I heard light tapping on the screen door like someone's tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent and didn't stop for nearly an hour. Midnight stared at the door, but even he won't go near it. The craziest part for me is that I had the feeling that someone's inviting me to the door, but at the same time, I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and to not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and stay where I am. Eventually, I pass out and wake up and everything's normal. The rest of the week I spent there was uneventful, and nothing else out of the ordinary happened. I totally admit that it could have all been in my head, but the fact that my dog was acting up too makes me really worried about the whole situation. A bit of preface here. I was around 10 or 11 when this happened. Old enough to stay home alone, but not old enough to recognise some red flags. I attended camp over the summer, the typical 8 to 3 route. Now my house sits at the end of my street, which forms the U, but for some reason, the bus driver would never drop me off at my house. I would always get dropped off at the end of my street, where I would toddle myself all the way back. Both my parents work late hours, sometimes not getting back until 8 PM, and it would be very expensive to hire a babysitter for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So, starting 6th grade, when the bus dropped me off at home, I'd be by myself. I'd do the usual middle school routine, play games online and watch TV. Occasionally, my neighbour's cat would come into my backyard and I'd feed her or play with her. The only computer in the house was my dad's workroom one, which has a window overlooking a deck, and the window overlooking the side of the house. We have large bay windows in the living room, dining room, and kitchen of my home, and since we sit on a hill, you can pretty much see the entire backyard from a nice vantage point. So most days when I got home, I toss off my backpack and go right to that room, and you could see me walk from my front door and pop up by the computer from outside. Unfortunately, this would lead to something that I had forgotten about until now. When I got off the bus, I did as expected, go into my dad's workroom, play computer games. About 30 minutes into this, I hear a faint meowing coming from outside the window. I pause and look outside, thinking my neighbour's cat has wandered over, but when I get there I see nothing. I just sat back down and resumed playing, only to hear the meowing again. It was quiet but noticeable, and so I checked out the other window. Nothing. This routine happened for a good 10 minutes and eventually I get frustrated and go into the living room to watch TV. Not even 2 minutes later, meowing from the window I was sitting at happens again. Now I'm confused and a little creeped out, so I shut the blinds and keep trying to watch TV. The meows still go on, but only when they come from right behind me did I jump up and get scared and ready to leave. I went into my bedroom where the blinds were still down but cracked for sunlight. I tried to read a book, only to hear a meow come from outside my bedroom window now. This is enough to make me call my dad, concerned that maybe the cat was hurt, but I couldn't see it to be sure. He said he would have the neighbour come and check it out. 10 minutes go by. I get a call from my dad saying he's coming home from work. Nothing urgent about it, just that his job got cancelled and he's home early. I don't think anything of it. When he got home, I did realise the cat noises have stopped. Fast forward to the present, and I asked my dad about the incident, thinking it's funny about how a cat scared me. But what he said next made my blood run cold. After I called him, my neighbour indeed did come and check out my house. What he found were large footprints circling the house, right next to the windows. Someone had been stalking me through my house, seeing where I was, making cat noises trying to lure me outside. They must have known I was home alone, since it was easy to see me. And they must have known that I played with the cat. My neighbour immediately called my dad and searched the property, but found no one. The police weren't called since there was nothing but footprints that led into the woods. I never saw anyone. My dad stayed home with me for the rest of the week. It sickens me to think that people would use those tactics to try and lure someone like my younger self out of their homes to do God knows what in the woods with them. I was driving to work. It's about a 5-hour drive. It was already dark, and about 3 hours of driving in, I start getting really tired. I bought myself a coffee and some snacks at a gas station and continue on, but snacks and coffee can only keep you awake for a certain amount of time, and I feel really dozy. This part of the road is nothing but thick pine wood around me. There's no other cars on the road or anything. Only insects smashing into my windshield now and then on the empty road. Now I'm extremely tired, and at one point I nearly drove off the road, for almost falling asleep. I have to sleep now. I can't wait for a gas station. I must stop or I'm gonna crash. Now, I have such an urgent feeling to find a place where I can stop. It felt like an hour, but it was probably about 5 minutes to go by, and I spot this little pocket in the road. It's like a parking space for quick stops, like peeing, switching drivers and stuff, not a resting area. I stop there, turn down my windows to check if I hear any weird noises, and there's total silence. I turn up my windows again. Nothing bad's gonna happen. I haven't seen a car for like 30 minutes and the road's empty. If someone's checking out my car, I bet it's the cops checking on me to see if I'm okay. I leave my keys in the ignition and lock the doors, just to be safe. I adjust my seat a bit and make it comfortable to sleep in, and I take off my shoes and put them on the passenger seat to the right. It was so nice, and I close my eyes and instantly fall asleep. Now I don't know why, but something wakes me up. I can't explain it. I can't really see anything. Some kind of bright light hits me in the eyes though. First I think it's a flashlight, but now I realise that it's the high beams of a car in my rear view blinding me. I look to my left and I see a dude walking up beside my car. Maybe he wants help with something. Should I make it clear to him that I'm here? He's right beside my left back door. Should I step out and ask what he's doing? I didn't have to. The dude proceeds to jerk and pull on my left door. I almost have a heart attack. He's trying to force his way in. My seat is adjusted to lay down, and I push it back as far as I can. I can reach the pedals, which makes it almost impossible for me to drive my car. I slam the horn and it breaks the silence with a roar and the dude jumps back. That gives me like 2 seconds to push my seat and reach the pedals, but it's still out of adjusting, and I'm pulling myself really hard towards the steering wheel. Because my seat is lying flat, it's not supporting my back and it kind of hurts. Anyway, I start my car and drive, kinda, with a cloud of smoke. It's hard driving a car with nothing holding you up properly, but I manage. As soon as I look in my rear view, he stands up looking at me. And what's worse, I can see 2 more guys next to him. I can see the silhouette of their high beams. One of them has something in his hand like a crowbar. I drive super fast, way over the speed limit. I'm terrified. Then, I stop at a gas station to sort my seat out and put my shoes on. I figure out I was only asleep for like 10 minutes, which makes me worried that they were following me. I'm really worried now. I told my boss the next day, and he actually said he's heard of problems like this all over Sweden before, where criminals will stop you and rob you or do worse things. I have never had anything like it in my life, and it makes me terrified to stop when I'm driving again. This happened a long time ago. I was 12 and at my grandparents' village. We had a cow and an ox, and usually the son of the bull, usually just one, took all the cattle to graze at night, and he would take them back. Cows know where to go when going home. My grandpa had a male ox, and since my father was an adult and he wasn't there, I took the responsibility. Basically, my job was to go around the village with the ox tailing after me, calling the people to open their doors. Our ox would grunt, and to call the herd, and all the females would then come out. From then on, I had to take them to a clearing up area in the mountain, and then take them by the river. It was easy. The animals knew where they were going. They were calm, and our bull was a gentle giant. All I did was have to ride him with thin rope on his horns. If any of the females wandered off, all I did was call in or occasionally poke her with a stick in the right direction. My grandpa said that if I see a wild, very rare boar or fox, I should just stay on the ox. Not many animals dare to go near an ox herd. There is a dark part of the forest where it's very quiet, and even the bravest hunters won't go. It is slippery and dangerous. They said that even the deer and boar don't go there. I was forbidden to go there and honestly never wanted to. So during this event, it's during the morning and everything seems fine. I was on the ox going up the mountain. I was glad he let me because it was a hard trek up. I saw that one of the females is wandering off. I followed her and left our ox and the dogs to guide the herd. She went into the forest and I ran to her. I tried steering her away, but she continues. She went in the dark part and stopped. I didn't want to go off just in case she ran back and left me there. And then I heard a crunch and turn around, and a very old man is walking towards us. He looks frail with dirty clothes and has a long beard. I was scared. I'd never seen anything like this my entire time out there before. Now, I laid on the ox clinging to her, not wanting to fall if she ran. Oxes aren't like bulls. They don't jump or kick when scared. They either attack with their horns or run. I was ready to hold on no matter what she chose. Our oxen don't take kindly to strangers, and before I took them out in the mornings, they're always paranoid. Now that's a good thing though, because they trusted their owners. But knowing her, I knew she would either bolt or attack. But weirdly, she just stood there. The stranger then came to us and petted her on the head, whispering something I didn't understand. He looks at me, and his eyes are completely white. Then he turns around and disappears into the trees. Suddenly, the female grunted as though she had woken up now. It was crazy. I'd never seen her act like it before. She suddenly bolts away with "Come," and we found the herd. I quickly got on our ox and yelled water. He knew that command and went down towards the river. I then ran into one of the houses and tried to explain everything. The couple there stayed with me and sent their daughter to call my grandpa. I literally couldn't sleep for days remembering those white eyes. My grandparents wouldn't let me out of the house after that, even if it is just to play in the trees. Later I learned they were protecting me from a lesnik, a forest spirit which can take the form of a man or an owl or wolf. It hates when people go to his part of the woods and can kidnap you. I later learnt that the ox which took me there fallen ill and died almost immediately after. I used to do a ton of camping, but one night, still early on, I was up with two friends in the middle of the night, just hanging out in a field next to the campsite, looking at the stars and almost full moon. It was so bright outside, it's almost like a daytime moment. When suddenly, I noticed a faint whisper. I thought it was someone from camp, but no, it came from the other direction. We all went quiet and listened to the faintest "hey," to which we follow, cross the field away from the camp, and the whispers grow louder, but ever so slightly. That's until we come across a road. Across the road was a fenced-in area, but it's got a pretty bad fence. It's easily crossed. On the other side of the fences was a small woods. The trees are spaced pretty far apart from each other, and the moonlight's not really doing much. Now, it's pretty dark out there, under the trees. You could barely see past the first few rows, and now, the voice is much louder, but still, as if someone's trying to whisper. A voice that sounds like a girl saying, "Come play." Craziest part is that there's no women with us on that trip, and we can just hear the sounds of a little girl whispering for us to come and play in the pitch blackness at 1 in the morning. We decided to not investigate any further. My ex-boyfriend and I did a rainforest walk, which dips deep down to the bottom of the forest. There's no other cars in the car park, and we didn't come across any hikers. We have it all to ourselves and had a great time for the most part. As we're walking up, my ex was ahead of me and suddenly stopped, raising his hand to signal for me to stop. I look up and there's this woman staring at us ahead. She looks normal, but I get a chill as soon as I see her. Something about her's off. She had dark brown hair, which I only noticed because it contrasts so highly against her cardigan. Now her cardigan was all I could focus on. It went right down to her feet and was bleach white, as though it had just been pulled off a rack, but we're in a forest. How is it so white? And why on earth would you wear it hiking? We stare at her for what must have been 30 or 40 seconds, but feels like an eternity. There was no way I was going to take another step towards her. Instead, I felt this kind of stillness, as if the forest around us froze in time and went silent. She finally turned around and started to walk slowly back up the trail. We watched her and waited, not saying a word to each other, until she's out of sight before we start going again. The car park was still around half an hour away, and we just fast walked in silence, a bit on edge, just trying to listen for anything. We look back and don't see her. It's absolutely the strangest thing that ever happened to me. The one thing I can't explain was how her cardigan was perfectly white. Even the bottom of it had no signs that she had been in the forest whatsoever. It gives me chills thinking of it. This happened 1 year ago, over the course of 5 months, but I've decided now that I want to see other people's opinions on it. I live in a rural area with a few houses around, but plenty of forest, and out of nowhere, around 10 to 12 at night, there would be a series of knocks on one side of the house, which isn't odd if it's one time, but this happened many times over the course of 5 months. If I had to put a number on how many times it happened, it's probably around 30. It's the exact same kind of knocking. At first, we thought maybe it's just some kids banging on the other side of the house, but no kid has enough dedication to continue it for this long with no reward. Also, I've stepped outside to see if anything's there, and literally, it's as if no one's there. I don't really believe in the paranormal, but I genuinely have no clue as to what this could be. When I was younger, I used to have this recurring dream that a girl in a white dress would come to me. At first she was harmless. She would never say anything to me. She would just stand at the foot of my bed and stare at me with these weird black eyes. Now it was almost like a lucid dream, because I would wake up in the exact setting that I fell asleep in every single time, whether I was staying at my grandma's house or if I was staying in my own bed. It would always happen. Now my father was a park ranger and a very strong man, so I always felt safe having my dad around. But there was one time that he wasn't around, and what happened I could never explain. Now, the exact same thing happened. I was so used to it. I wake up in the night, and there's a girl in that pure white dress just staring at me. This time, she raises her hand at me and wants me to come with her. I'm not gonna hold her hand. I've rubbed my eyes and it feels like I'm not even in a dream, but I know that I am. She suddenly takes off and sprints outside, into the yard, then into the forest. Even in my dream mind, I still think, hell no, I ain't going out there. And I just go back to sleep. When I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that something was off about that dream. I kind of forget about it. A few years later, I hear off my dad that he's also had the same dreams, and some of the other park rangers have too that he works with, and he's never been able to explain it. He just thought it was nothing more than a dream. Well, that was until one day, I was out with my dad. We were just gonna go into the forest for a small hike together. I was really looking forward to it and always enjoyed doing so. As we get there, just on the tree line where the forest starts, my dad stops dead in his tracks. I've never seen my dad look so scared in his life, and this is literally someone that I've never seen be scared of anything. He says to me, "Don't move," and he goes and picks up a stick. I can finally see what he's looking at, and my god, it is terrifying. It was the exact same dress that the girl in my dream would wear. Literally as though it's just been placed there, no dirt on it whatsoever. My dad goes up to it and pokes it with a stick. We don't need to say anything to each other. It was the exact same thing that both of us had dreamt of. We both sprinted back to the house and agreed not to tell my mum about it, not to scare her. I found out later that my dad actually went there to go and investigate further to see if someone was playing a prank on us, but literally, later in that day, the dress vanished without a trace. It's the single most crazy and unexplainable thing that's ever happened in my life. If it was only me having the dreams and this experience, I wouldn't have been as scared, but the fact that my dad had it too? Crazy. Now my native language is French, so sorry if there's any problems telling this story. This happened last week. I was searching for a cave with my girlfriend, and in France, we have incredibly detailed maps telling us every cave that has been explored. We decided to go to a cave which has a famous area, and there's caves littering the landscape there. So there's a very wooded area. The hills and valleys are very narrow. We spot a good place to start looking at the bottom of a small creek and make our way up. We go to the dirt and then further into the gravel and then the boulder field. That's when I remembered this sub, because we stopped walking at the same time. It was silent. Dead silent. Not even a bird. It's the kind of silence that actually oppresses you. We eventually continued walking uphill and come across a cave. Soon after, a bird breaks the silence, and we realised we are almost dead for asphyxiation. We didn't dare to breathe in silence. Now, I've heard of other people having this before, but to experience it yourself is absolutely crazy. I mean, think, it wasn't something we heard that scared us, it was the silence. And it's not just that, you almost feel as though you're being stalked or someone's watching you. Maybe it's a primitive thing that lets us know there's a predator or person in the area, and the animals did the same. But there were no insect sounds either. That's what scares me the most. Usually I just think it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the fact that both of us stopped at the exact same time? Crazy. The details I have on this story are very vague, but someone told me about a teenager who went into the Apocaly National Forest to hike, and then was reported missing several days later when he didn't return home. A couple of months later, when he was found in the woods, he was a different person, appearing like he was drunk. He was tested but had no signs of drugs or alcohol. The negative results. Mentally, he wasn't all there, but physically, there's no signs of him being exposed to anything to cause this. He kept telling people that he encountered something strange. It was several months before he was himself again, and he had very little memory of what happened on those days. I've asked people that I know who live in Apocaly or have camped and hiked in the Apocaly National Forest, and they've never heard this story. I really didn't know this person who told me this story, but it's crazy. I do know that over the years, people have gone into the Apocaly National Forest and never came out. Some of them are harmed or killed by animals, others murdered by the worst enemy of all, humans, and never found again with a trace. Now, I've driven through the forest on State Highway 40, and it's creepy as hell. It's creepy enough in daytime. I guess I'll dive right into what happened, and not bore you with the unimportant details. I was hiking on a trail I'm very familiar with, and because of the changes in the weather, I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods. I wanted to try and get to my car before a downpour, and I knew this area like the back of my hand. Before I knew it, I felt very disorientated and nothing appears familiar. I'm not too sure if the woods seemed silent before or after I felt this way, but I become undeniably aware of how silent everything is. Oppressingly downright suffocating silence, and my heart began to pound as I stood in place, and it felt as though the woods were spinning and closing around me. It was like I'd stepped into something that I could not comprehend. It was then I noticed something about 15 feet in front of me. It was 10 feet high and about 8 foot wide and distorted. It was like something was bending the light and moving towards me, like a fogged up mirror almost, but with no definitive shape. But it was moving with purpose and intelligence, and would be completely unnoticeable if not for the distortion within and me directly looking at it. I turned to run, and realised another's behind me, the same size and shape. Almost then I realised that there's at least 4 of these things closing in around me, and I'm trapped. What I was seeing my brain cannot make sense of, and I'm in utter panic, shocked and back up against a tree, terrified to run in the direction of those things. I curl up into the fetal position, pull my hands over my ears. They had begun ringing, and the sound was deafening. I closed my eyes as these intelligent looking cloaked things were all around me, about 5 feet in height. I saw a white flash, like what happens if you ever hit the ground really hard. That's the best way I can describe it. My ears were ringing. The flash, then nothing. I woke up to rain falling on me. Hours had passed. Everything looks normal, and I knew where I was. I gathered myself, checked for injuries, and realized that, weirdly, I'm completely fine. I drove home. I can't make sense of what happened. I've googled similar events but found nothing quite like what happened to me. I have no history of mental illness or other things that could have caused this. I've stumbled across stealth cloaking technologies used by the military, and the technology is primitive compared to what I witnessed. I just don't have the answers, and I don't know what happened to me or why. I've never had anything like it since. I just hate this. I'm definitely going to be seeing a doctor tomorrow. I have no history of seizures or other health issues. I'm in my 20s and fit and sound of mind, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. And now this happened in Ireland, and I was in the Midlands, so I'd rather not be too specific. So my story isn't recent, but I needed to share this. I'm 19 now, but this took place when I was 12. It's something that's always stuck in my mind. The night this encounter happened, everything was pretty normal. I was going back to school the next morning after summer break, so I had to be in bed earlier than I wanted to be. I remember falling asleep to the movie Meet the Robinsons, playing at probably 10:30 p.m. And then I woke up, and I knew it had to be late. But the first thing that I registered was that the TV is completely scrambled. I mean, almost like a DVD that doesn't play so it skips. But it was frozen, so the image was warped and boxy. Except the Meet the Robinsons DVD was fine. At this point, I guess it's around 2 or 3 a.m. The second thing I registered was that there's voices coming from the kitchen. I got out of bed to see what was going on because the voices are talking really loud and sound panicky. When I got to the kitchen, I realised that it was my mum and older sister arguing. The first thing I actually picked up on and comprehended was my mum saying, "Those are definitely aliens, what else could they be?" Almost sounding hysterical. Neither of them saw me enter the kitchen, but I asked what's going on, and my mum looked at me, and I knew she's scared and shaken. She literally had tears in her eyes. She told me in an almost sad voice that aliens were outside. At this point, we're all standing in the kitchen in front of our sliding glass door that looks across the yard. There's a field there. I was confused, so she pulled back the curtain to the kitchen door, and I don't see anything initially. I don't look hard enough. But I then saw my huge dog, German Shepherd and Great Dane mix, sitting in the middle of the yard in the direction of the neighbours, which was to my house on the right side. I asked my mum why he isn't sitting on the porch like normal and why he's so still. To that she said, "You can slide the door very slowly, but don't make too much noise." And usually when the door to the house is open, my dog looks towards it and runs in, but he doesn't. He's still gazing. I didn't realise what was going on, but I was scared because my mum was clearly scared, as my older sister is too. My mum signalled to my sister and I to be quiet, and we were. On a normal night, you can hear animals in the woods, or the trees in the wind, and crickets chirping because it was summer, but that night, we can't hear anything. It's completely silent outside, not even a breeze. This gives me chills that makes me shake. Something's terribly off. My mum shut the door, and my sister and I followed her to the bedroom where my dad was asleep and the windows open. She explains what's going on. She told me that my sister is in my room looking for something and peeks out my window. My room is in the back of the house and my window looks out to the trees behind the house. She saw what she thought was a pack of coyotes, but there's 30 of them, and the closer she looks, she starts to see distinguishable features, and that's when she dipped out of the room and told my mum. But before she could get there, my mum said that she walked outside before my sister came to say what she saw, and saw a tall, dark, slender figure walking down the neighbour's driveway towards our house. She thought it was the neighbour coming over for some reason, but then she suddenly got scared and felt it's best to pretend she's asleep so she wouldn't have to talk to the neighbour. And those events lead us to go into the kitchen window that overlooks the neighbours' houses right next to each other. It's dark. I'm looking very hard and I can see shadowy figures. Most of them are small and very quick, so fast that if you weren't paying attention you wouldn't have noticed, and if you paid even more, you could see the slower, taller ones. They move slow and the silhouettes are dark, darker than their background, almost fluid looking. It doesn't look real at all. And this sucks, but we didn't even think about grabbing a camera and trying to get pictures, which is something I regret. Another thing I noticed that's worth mentioning was that behind the neighbour's house they had woods too. Well within the trees and very low to the ground, there were 3 evenly spaced out lights. One was green, one was red, and another's bluish. The lights were pretty dim. They were never there before though. We watched out the window for about 10 minutes freaking out. My mum almost wheezing because she's so scared. After that, she took us into her room and opened the window more, which I didn't like. It made me more scared. She says be quiet, and since we couldn't hear anything at all coming from outside, we sit in silence until we heard what sounded like a car passing. And we hear the engine sound, but we can just about make out the road from my mum's window, and we see no cars, no headlights, nothing. The engine buzz was loud and turned into something like a plane passing over the house. This lasts for about a minute, then it's completely silent again. After a few minutes the sound would repeat. Eventually, after all this happened, my mum shut the window and the curtains and we sat there shaking. Another thing to point out was that I did eventually work up the courage to go back to my room, but that was a few hours later and it was getting light out. The TV scrambled so I checked the disc, and it's not working, so I ended up unplugging the DVD player to get it off the screen. That's about all that happened that night, but it freaked me out so bad that it makes me cry thinking of it. Not to mention that I wasn't the only one that saw it. I hate that I even witnessed this at such a young age. It was truly horrifying. A lot of you wanted to know my cousin's story on the skinwalker, but I'm going to try and get to the actual story from him tomorrow and fill you in there. I do have another one though that I'd like to share, however. This one doesn't have anything to do with skinwalkers, at least I don't think so. There was an old legend about a lost town in the forest near where I lived, and for the most part, it was only a legend. However, it was noted as being true, and a ghost town is near my town. The story that I'm about to tell is one that happened when I was 11, and still scares me to this day. My dad likes to take me on the little off-road rides in his Jeep. It wasn't necessarily an off-road one either. It was a Cherokee, so it wasn't really built for the backwoods dirt trails. He decides to do this and go throughout a park with me and told me that it's going to be fun and we could go and check out the ruins of an old building. We decide along the way that we're gonna have a real good exploration here. There was one of those official vehicles only gates on this dirt road we come up to, and usually that would stop people, but my dad just decides to break the lock and push it open anyways. My father was ever the best to listening to rules, but sometimes he had to break them. About 30 minutes into our drive on this road, he's shining a flashlight out of the window, trying to find this building, and he has his headlights on full. We're both looking for signs of, well, anything. Eventually we come upon this really steep hill. He says, "Oh, I think I remember this," and just guns it up there. Naturally, we get stuck at a certain angle. We can't reverse or accelerate. My dad never likes to admit when he's wrong, and said he can fix it, and started thinking that he's going to be able to fix this really easily. I was very curious, and I still am, and I got the flashlight and started looking into the woods around us. I'm kind of worried about bears or wolves, to be honest. I then noticed a little light in the valley below us, and turned off the flashlight to see it. At the same time, my dad's cursing at our car, and I decided to get a little closer to the light and see if I can figure out what it was. Mainly to see if there was somebody who could help us. As I got closer to it, the trees took it apart a little bit, and I can see there's a very small town. The best way I can describe it is like a town from the movie Big Fish. Just very numbered set of buildings. As I got closer, I hear voices, and I saw people, but something just seemed really weird, like they weren't really there. I decided to try and get closer to the town, but the closer I get, the more weirded out I feel. I eventually felt if I didn't turn around, I would never come back, which is very odd, and I've never had this feeling before. I decided to turn around and go back to my dad. He didn't get the car unstuck by himself, at least, and we just slept in the car. The following morning, the park ranger showed up, and after a lengthy talk with my dad and a very hefty ticket, he helps us get the car unstuck and be on our way. Before we left, I try and catch another glimpse of the village, and it was the ruins that my dad was talking about. I talked to the park ranger about it, and he said, well, this was once a thriving village, just lost in time. I decided not to say anything about what I saw to the park ranger, but did tell my dad, but his usual skepticism turned me away. I have visited since, and it's a pretty decent place, and I told my friends about what I saw, and they believed me for the most part, and we decided to stay out one night to try and find it and see if anything happened, but of course nothing did. But I still remember that night as if it was yesterday, and I still get goosebumps thinking of it. I went hiking with one of my old friends. He used to be homeless and in a bad situation with his parents, so I let him stay with me until he got back on his feet. One evening, before he officially started staying, we went one day into the woods to get his stuff from an area that he was posted up at during the night. It's probably 11 PM when we meet up. I got off work late. We go to the woods to pick up his stuff, and we kind of get lost in the dark. It was abnormally dark considering the full moon was fixing to come around from its phase. Neither of us have flashlights, and my phone had died, so I can't use it. Bad planning, I'll admit that. We stumble across a bunch of decently large moulds of dirt in the offshoots of the woods. Each mound had a small tree growing from the middle, and a crude blank sign at the tops. By this point it's eerily quiet, considering we're very close to the deepest part of the woods where there should be lots of sounds. We eventually found his campsite and hurried out. Outside of the woods now, we're walking down a one-way street leading to the main road. A large moving truck comes our way and slows and passes by us. We pay no mind to it and just nod and keep going. The truck turns around and pulls into a little offshoot, stopping parallel to us with the engine on. The driver gets out and watches us. We weren't being conspicuous or anything by looking back, just glancing over the shoulder here and there. Nothing you can make out in the darkness from the distance has, anyhow. We're almost at the top of the street, and we're near my car when he goes back in his truck and I guess opens the back door. The next thing we hear is 3 large dogs barking their heads off and a flashlight pointing our way. We started running and had to do some evading through neighbourhood streets before we could get back. Nothing ever come of it. No cops, no local town chatter, nothing. I still have no idea what we ran across, but I knew we shouldn't have been there. I have a horrible feeling that this could have ended a lot worse for us. So this happened about 15 years ago to my brother and me, and I still can't come up with a satisfactory logical answer to our experience. For detail, this happened in Ontario, Canada, and we were 8 and 5 at the time. It's in a suburban area, built around a medium-sized forest, and our house backs onto the woods. We were driving home with our mum, and we were arguing. She told us to get out and walk the rest of the way. She dropped us off in front of the woods at the playground. There's a connected public path leading back up through the woods to our street. It's about a 5-minute walk away, and a small hill between the playground and the main road. We weren't pleased that we got in trouble, so we made up quickly and start playing on the sliding swings. My brother goes up and says, "Hey, who are those guys?" I look over and saw 2 men dressed in black suits, white shirts and black sunglasses coming over the top of the hill towards us. They're walking briskly and purposely in our direction. They had brown hair, not close cropped but short and fairly pale skin. It's beyond bizarre. It scared me immediately. I told my brother to come down the slide and we have to go home. They had already unnerved him enough that he actually listened to me. We started down the path, and when I look over my shoulder, they're still coming towards us quickly. That was horrifying, so I start to walk even faster, holding my brother's hand. Maybe 30 seconds later, I looked behind me again, and they've started running. They're gaining on us. That pushes us over the edge, and I scream at my brother to run home as fast as he can. I know he's quicker than me. I think he's going to be able to tell my parents if we're going to be kidnapped. I have honestly never ran so fast in my life, and we didn't look behind us again until we made it home. Our parents were still unloading the groceries and were surprised. They figured out that we had spoken to someone, and they couldn't really understand exactly what happened as the men never said a word. They're accompanied by a wall of silence. Neither of us have ever experienced anything like it again, and it wasn't until a year later that I watched the BuzzFeed Unsolved episode about Men in Black that I realised what I had encountered. My dad and I went on a hiking trip a few days ago. My dad is a waterfall fanatic. He wants to see as many as possible. So he and I are hiking along a very pretty trail. We're hiking along a river. It's flowing nicely. There's mountains all around us. The trail is weaving around big, beautiful boulders. I'm hiking at most 30 feet ahead of him, looking for a spot to sit down and have picnic lunch on. and as I round a blind curve in the trail, I just freeze. Sitting on a stump maybe 10 feet off to the right is a guy, but he's wearing one of those colourful badger hoodies. With the hoodie pulled up, he's wearing a Halloween style bunny mask. He sees me and stands up right after my dad rounds a corner. We are all three sizing each other up in silence, and my dad addresses him. "What's up, buddy?" The masked man then tips his head as though he's deciding what to do with us. He then finally speaks, saying, "Oh, not much. You aren't the guys I'm waiting for. You have a good day." And then he turns and jogs off quickly. Strapped on his lower back is a large hunting knife and a pistol. We lose sight of him pretty quick. We hadn't seen a soul on the trail all day, and we'd been there for almost 4 hours. Needless to say, we leave the waterfall for another day and turn quick. Once we're off the trail, we report it to the local forest service and police, but they say they can't do much aside from keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. Now, the guy had no backpack or water or anything, which makes me think that he either had it stashed somewhere or was camping nearby. I hate to admit it, but I desperately wanted to ask the guy who he was looking for and why. Let me start by saying that I love camping. Anytime my friends and I come home from college, we loaded up our cooler with beer, grab some gear and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or friends ever wanted to go with me, so I often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed my gear, hopped in my car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that's secluded yet within safety of civilization if I need to get help. Camping also creeps me out though, but that feeling is always outweighed by the joy of it. So I make a little camp and a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much, but I'm enjoying myself reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling that I'm being watched and stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, but see a doe vault from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to camping. I just kept freaking myself out though, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whistling and just enjoying myself. Around 1, I decided to get into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I'd been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars until I passed out. It's around 2 AM. I hear footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or some animal, maybe a raccoon, but I'm on guard. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open later, and I hear a rubbing sound and the tent fabric being pushed in a bit. I don't know what to do. I'm paralyzed with fear. I desperately wanted to go and get the knife and stab this person, but I think maybe it's one of my buddies messing with me. Suddenly, it stopped. I was starting to feel more secure because daylight's coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I'm sure as hell not gonna sleep. All of a sudden, it's about 4 o'clock. I realise I should have my boots on in case anything were to happen. After having stayed up and keeping alert for a little longer, my friend's car alarm goes screaming. I sprint out of the tent. I got about 2 steps out before something grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead, the person stops me. I've heard that people can perform insane feats of strength with adrenaline rush. In my case, I just clamped down. His finger popped off almost. He screamed and pulled his hand away. He took off, running down the hill and into the opposite direction. I take off. I must have looked ridiculous, but I didn't care. I quickly make it into the car and speed it out of there, calling up my friends, telling them what's happened and the police, and get some real clothing. When the cops get there, they checked it out. The cops went out with a light. They brought me back some of my things that I left there. But what made me most scared is that right next to the tent was a gas can, and lighter fluid had been poured around my tent. The kicker is, they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there is some crazy guy that's looking to make fires in tents with people in them. Growing up, every summer in July and August, my family would get together and camp out for 2 weeks at the White Lake State Park in Tamworth, NH. Some of my best childhood memories were made there, with rollerblading, Nerf gun wars, etc. Now when I was around my late teens, my family stopped gathering together to camp out after my grandpa passed away. One of the last years I was there, this one particular memory always stuck with me. A little over 10 years ago, I was 16 years old. It was around 10 PM at night when I noticed I had a missed call on my cheap little track phone. My family was sitting around the campfire cooking s'mores and sharing some laughs, so I decided to go and get some privacy to return the call. I then took a long narrow trail that winds in between other campsites that, at the end, leads up to the bathroom. I wasn't going up to the bathroom. I just wanted to find an empty campsite and sit at a picnic table to make my call. There was plenty of those, since this whole side of the campground was where I'm going and it's vacant. There was no other campers nearby in that area. It was quiet and dark, so I chose a campsite. I sit down at a table. There's lights from a distance that light up from behind the top of the hill behind me, illuminating my surroundings just a bit. I called my friend and was carrying on a conversation for around 20 minutes. As I'm sitting there, staring straight ahead, I see the silhouette coming down from the road in front of me. The figure is coming towards my direction, where all the empty campsites are. I can see it's a person. It's not that unusual to see people strolling through the campsite for a night walk. The people I see usually have flashlights, so this person doesn't, but I'm not creeped out, just curious. As the person gets closer, I can see the outline better now, and it's a man. I also noticed his pace slows down. I kept my eyes fixated on him as I continue conversing on my cell phone. A minute or two passes by now, and now he's stopped moving. He's just standing there in the road looking straight into the campsite where I'm at. Now I don't know if he can see me. Oh wait, he can now. He's staring at me. I step back. He was a little heavy and tall. I can make out he's wearing a jacket. I can't see many facial features, but I would guess that I was staring at a man in his late 40s or 50s. Alarm bells are going off in my head now. My mind has turned to mush at this point and I'm frozen. I was no longer listening to what my friend is saying. I just stare off at this guy. He starts moving now. He was tiptoeing towards me, very carefully, like he didn't want to make a sound. He put one foot in front of the other, leaned forward in a slight hunch form. It looked as though he was charging towards me. In that moment, I snapped out of my mind-mushy frozen state and leaped forward off the picnic table and began running through the campsite back towards the trail. Thud, thud, thud. I can hear him getting closer now, leaves scuffling, heavy yet fast footsteps. Footsteps were getting louder and closer. I made it back to that narrow trail. Once he gets close to whereabout I was, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and the sound of someone annoyed that they've tripped or hurt themselves. Most likely he wasn't familiar with the trail like I was. Whatever the reason it was, it causes him to just stop. I don't stop looking back. I just keep running and running until finally I make it back to my family's campsite. When I got back there, they're still having laughs and smiles by the campfire. I break down crying and I'm trembling. I explain what happened, and my aunt woke up and said, "Oh God." He probably thought that he was someone he knew and was doing it as a joke, dismissing me. My cousin saying, "Yeah, he probably stopped running after he realised he didn't know you, idiot." I wish I was taken seriously, but other than that one thing happening, there was no reason for them to really be afraid. My experience makes me think twice about going alone camping now. I always carry pepper spray with me too, and an alarm. I hope I never see that guy again. Now, while I was growing up, my family would visit the same lake every year for every summer weekend. As we got older, we would visit a large rock we called the Cliffs and jump off it. The rock's only about 15 feet tall at the highest point. For the water, that's really deep. When we got older, we would jump in and try and touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens, we took our kayaks to the cliff's edge to jump on our own. We jump off several times. We then find a nice cold spot at the very top of the cliffs and chill there for a bit. As we're sitting there, we notice a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It's the letter H. Eventually, it sank back into the water and we lose sight. Before we can look away or even say anything else, another shape was floating upwards, the letter E. Eventually, it too sank below, but it was followed by two more letters, L, P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up without saying a word and left. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it even happened. Several years ago, I was working as a camp counselor and told this story as a ghost story. I'd almost forgotten about it and texted my brother to see if I hadn't made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we jumped off the cliffs and saw something in the water. He said yes. I asked him what it was and he too said it spelled out help. One of my friends always has these get-rich-quick schemes or shady ways of making money on the side. Now, in one of his more brilliant moves, he decides that he's going to rent a house out near the country line to host illegal poker games in. Yep. Anyway, on this property is probably 4 or 5 acres with this tiny rundown church about 1,000 yards away on the side, and there's a redneck guy who lives on the side in a trailer probably a quarter a mile or so down the road. However, the property backs up to the woods and since it's always cheaper than the range, and I and a third friend ask our renter friend if we can go shoot some guns on the property. He obliges us, and we head out there on a Saturday afternoon and find a nice berm at the tree line to shoot into. Now we're just shooting paper targets with pistols, so we're not that far back, and don't need that much room to do so. After a few magazines, we decide to venture deep into the woods to see just how far the property goes. Now we get down to the bottom of the hill and see fluorescent ribbons that the server ties to the trees to mark property lines. We realise that the property is way bigger than we ever thought before. We're already 200 yards into the woods now. Now just as we're remarking how big it is, we see a dead animal about 10 yards away from the property line. Walking up to examine it, we see that it's a goat that's had its head cut off, clearly done by a human. Then we see a severed goat head a little further away. Now the really creepy part to this is that it's not the same goat. There's two separate ones, and clearly due to the decay, it's been multiple days apart. Now if we weren't armed it would have been way scarier, but it's still creepy because I fear humans more than anything in the woods now. Now I say this was out in the country, but it's in South Carolina, so there's really not crazy expanses of wilderness being an East Coast state that's pretty much all settled by people. The thing that gets me now is that there was a serial killer caught not too long ago around the time we were there, and apparently he started on animals too.